might be. We are welcoming you to another series of ICEJ webinars, a weekly series broadcasting live from Jerusalem every Thursday at 4 p.m. Jerusalem time. My name is Mojmir Kallus. I'm the Vice President for International Affairs, part of the leadership team here in Jerusalem, and I'm going to lead you into another part of our discussion on the weekly Torah portion, the part of the Bible which is read in synagogues by Jews all around the world. And of course, we are looking at it from a New Testament Christian point of view. I will be joined soon by my colleague and leader of the whole ICEJ, President Jürgen Bühler. He just has some problems with joining with his computer, so he asked me to start, and I hope that he will join us soon. So this is the third part of a series which is called The Life of Abraham, and we are going through the book of Genesis and looking at different parts where the life of Abraham is described. We already had two sessions, one on the parashat Lech Lecha, which starts in Genesis 12 with the famous command by the Lord to Abraham, go ye to the land which I will show you, and you need to leave your family and your tribe, all of your culture, and go to the place which I will show you. So that was the beginning of Abraham's journey. And then we also talked about in the next portion called Vayera, we talked about different aspects of Abraham's life, some of his tests, some of his weaknesses, which were exposed by also his great spirit of intercession as he tried to save the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. We talked about what was actually wrong in those cities, and of course the climax of his life, as it were, the birth of Isaac, and immediately or soon after that, the major test which Abraham had to go through when he was told to sacrifice his son. We know that he received him back, and he believed that the Lord would be actually able to raise him from the dead. So that was one of the tests of obedience and faith of Abraham. And today we are concluding this three-part series by looking at the last days of Abraham, but even before that, on the last days of Sarah. The whole portion which starts in Genesis chapter 23 and goes on the next three chapters, 24 and 25. It is called in Hebrew by the first words in Genesis 23, verse 1, about the life of Sarah, Chaye Sarah. So it starts by informing us that Sarah died in a blessed age of 127 years. And then we read the story of how Abraham buried her and all that was connected to that. I welcome Jürgen. I'm glad that he could join us now. So we are going to have this conversation together. And if you allow me, Jürgen, I would just, as an appetizer, start with one thought, which is repeatedly mentioned when people read this part of the Bible and think about its meaning. There are actually two stories, and we will probably look at them in more detail. And both stories are interesting in that they are quite long. There are many words which describe this business transaction between Abraham and the sons of Chaye when he was trying to buy a piece of land to bury his wife Sarah. So that's one real estate transaction, which is described in surprisingly great detail. And then the other story, which is even longer, is the story about getting a wife for Isaac. It is about Abraham who sent his trusted servant to a different land to bring wife for Isaac first he gives him detailed instructions, and then we read again almost the same thing said again, describing how actually the servant went about his task. And you know, the question, the obvious question is why these texts are so long and detailed. There are other texts in the Bible which may be describing even more dramatic situations, like even the binding of Isaac in the previous chapter, which are very concise. We can say that more is left out than what is actually said. And also, when you look at the story of getting the wife for Isaac, some of the commentators say, well, this is longer than the description of the whole creation of the world. So if the length of the text or the story signifies something, then why is that? The assumption is that the longer the text, the more important the story is. So what is so important about getting a real estate, a piece of real estate, or getting a wife for Isaac? And I would just, I would leave it hanging in the air. We will go back to this question, and I will just add to it. If you could think about a story in the New Testament, which is equally long and described in great detail, and under the assumption that the length of the story tells us something about its significance, we can also get some understanding about that particular story. Jürgen, can you think about a story in the New Testament which actually is repeated in all of the Gospels and which is really described in great detail?
Well, thanks, Mojmir, and apologies first of all for my late coming in, but I had some technical issues here in my office, and I managed to set up the computer started up only the last few minutes to be able for Zoom. But it is true, you know, those two stories are very long for the relative importance you might imagine, and it's paralleled. I think what you are hinting at is, of course, the crucifixion of Yeshua, which is described over many chapters.
Yes, and if it is true that it is a hint about the importance of that story, then we might understand that the description of the crucifixion is not only to tell us about the cruelty of that type of execution. After all, hundreds of people were being put to death by the Romans in those days, but about the importance of that particular man who suffered and died and rose again, because that is really a completely historical event which has no parallels in human history. And so simply looking at it from this point of view, that the length of the text and the level of detail into which the Bible goes is already a marker telling us, well, be aware that something extremely significant is going on. So anyway, what did the Lord show you when reading the text of Chaye, Sarah?
Well, it's in a way, you know what you hinted at it right now in the beginning. You know, I puzzled myself when I read those two passages or those two chapters myself. The purchase of that land, and then of course the story of Isaac and Rebecca. And I think, you know, what it hints at is that, you know, at that stage Abraham was already some 120 plus years old, and when he was younger, he received these amazing promises from the Lord, which told him, he says, I'm going to give you a land and I'm going to give you many descendants. And until that point, actually, it didn't happen. There wasn't a land that he owned, and he wasn't possessing any piece of the promised land. And the Bible even says in the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 11, he lived as a foreigner in this land, moving from tent to tent, from location to location. And then also regarding their descendants, there were two children by now, but anything falling short, of course, from great nations and descendants like the sand of the sea and like the stars of the heaven. So in a way, it's almost like Abram realized he's at the end of his life, and there are those big promises still over his life. And in a way, he became active. And I don't think he became active in a negative way like he did with Hagar, where he tried to put his fate in his own hand. But he realized he needed to do something about the fulfillment of those prophecies. And this is the first time where actually a Hebrew, or later on they would be called a Jew, was really in a literal sense possessing a piece of land here in the land of promise. The Bible speaks about this principle of first fruit. So you could say this was like a piece of first fruit for what would come later on, that they would have the whole land in the future as a nation. But Abraham was putting down his own investment, his own money, in order to get hold as a personal possession was a field with a cave. And this is until today one of the most holiest sites. I think it's the second holy site in Judaism, where Sarah and all the matriarchs and the patriarchs are being buried. So in a way, it was a first step. And the same also, he saw he was getting older, and his son Isaac, which was by that time already 40 years old, he didn't have a daughter. And so he charged one of his servants, many believe it was Eliezer, and he sent him off and made sure that there also will be a physical succession in the seed of Abraham. And one of the lessons what I learned from one of the rabbis that commented on that passage, he says that faith is always has a two-way direction. And that's, I think, a great formula or a great lesson for us. There's on the one side this blind trusting the Lord that he will do it, but it doesn't encourage us to just to sit in our armchair and wait until things become into fulfillment. God always asks us to do something. And I think that's the history of all great men. You know, I was reading the other day the autobiography of Reinhard Bonnke. As a young child, he received that prophecy one day he will become a missionary in Africa, but he needed to buy the tickets with his wife to go by ship down. He had to arrange things, and he had to do things in order to make it happen. And he became one of the great evangelists. But there was a whole sequence of actions, and that's what I believe we see with Abraham, that he received the promise, but he also understood he needed to do something in order that they will be fulfilled.
Yes, exactly. And actually, just like you said, these two stories that we had in the portion speak of the two important elements which together make up the Jewish nation, the land and the people. In Hebrew, these are the two key words, Zerah and Aretz. Aretz is the land, and Zerah is the seed. So in other words, the descendants of Abraham, the people of Israel. And Abraham did something to move forward on both lines. He did something for the land, and he did something for his descendants. Now, it's really interesting that he had been living in the land already for decades, and he never built a land for himself. We read in the Hebrew 11 that he never built a city. And he lived as a stranger, as a guest in the land. And the first thing he bought was a place for burial. So the question is, why so? Why would he not buy a piece of land to live rather than a piece to bury the dead? And I just read an interesting point here. One of the rabbis say that actually it teaches us that to settle in the land of Israel requires sacrifice. And only after you sacrifice and after you see your beloved one dead and bury her, this is where a seed is sown which will bear more fruit. So that's quite an interesting point. And they also ask the question why sacrifice or suffering is needed to live in the land of Israel. And we can extend it even today. It is not easy to live in the land of Israel. And that's why many Jews also prefer to live in America or in other nations where life is more comfortable. But the author said, and I will reveal my source, here's a nice book, which I can also recommend. It's Eretz Israel in the Parasha by Moshe Lichtman. It's going through the Torah portions and looking at what can we learn in relation to the land of Israel. And he says it is very important that Jews live in the land, but it is not easy. Why is it not easy? Because the purpose is that those who choose to live in the land of Israel get closer to God. Because with all the hardships and all the troubles and all the suffering, that brings you closer to God. And if you live comfortably, your heart becomes dull, and you tend to be very comfortable and not really interested in obeying God. So I find this, first of all, a valid thought. And I would say that it also has some lesson even for us Christians, because when the Lord is pruning us and is putting us through difficult circumstances, it usually produces the kind of faith and attitude, really expecting things from God and being relying on Him more. Of course, you can also trust God fully and live in comfort and in prosperity, but experience shows that it is harder. And when we look at even at modern Israel, we see this is a land half dry with enemies all around, and yet this pressure, this very pressure, has brought forth ingenuity, many different ways how they found solutions to the difficulties and actually are contributing with their inventions to the whole world. So that is also something which I believe is part of God's plan, and also is part of the whole restoration of Israel that we see today.
Yeah, no, you know what you say is so important also for our times in many ways. And you know, the connection of the Jewish people to the land and the concept of a physical land, it is something that in the past decades, Christians only were forced by the re-emergence of the state of Israel to even think about it, because we always are thinking about, of course, the kingdom to come and about the world to come and the heavenly Jerusalem. And now we are in a way confronted, you can say, with a very earthly Jerusalem. And it's quite amazing that this holy connection, you can almost call it, between Israel and the Jewish people and Eretz Israel, the very land, it is something quite unique, because once the Jewish people that were persecuted all over the world survived miraculously, and now they come to the land of Israel, and within the past 75 years, we are celebrating next year the 75th anniversary. This land, in a way you can say, really only entered into the fullness of what God has for them, at least to a certain degree. They don't recognize their Messiah, of course, yet, but it's a startup nation. It's a nation that right now, even in the midst of the whole global shakings, Israel seems to be more stable than ever and increasingly stable. So there is this connection. Since they are back in the land, they're really entering also into the promises that God was giving them.
And Jürgen, there's some background noise probably going from your microphone or something. So try to look at that.
Is it better now?
Not really. There is
Not really.
some kind of a.
All right, let me see if I can change the microphone settings.
It sounds like an engine of a car running, so something like that.
That's not good.
Now it's perfect. Now it's
perfect. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, I hope you understood what I said before, but
I think we did, but this is much better now. Thank you.
This is much better now. And maybe, one thought also, is that which brings us also in what's happening with Israel today. Abraham purchased that land, was the promised land, but he didn't say, well, God promised me, so this is my land, but he actually put a price down, and archaeologists and historians, they all believe that what he paid, those 400 shekel, was a complete ripoff. This was far overpriced to what a piece of land would have cost at that time, but he still paid it in order to get the possession of that land. And in a way, this is also what was taking place over the last 100 years when the Jewish people were coming back to Eretz Israel. Big part, huge chunks of that land was literally purchased by people like Baron Edmund Rothschild, who went in the late 19th, beginning of the 20th century and purchased huge parts of this land. And, many people today say, oh, they stole the land from the Palestinians or from the Arabs, but large parts literally have been purchased and made Jewish possession. And in a way, it's very interesting that when Abraham entered the land 4,000 years ago, and what we see today, it's almost like the same succession that you see Abraham purchasing this land even before his people came in, and individual Zionists purchasing huge parts of this land before the state of Israel was emerging.
Yes, and some of the commentators say that actually this text is one of the proofs that no one in the nations could say the Jews stole the land, that this particular land does not belong to them. Another case is Joseph's tomb in Shechem. And just incidentally, both Hebron and Nablus or Shechem are hotly disputed places today, where all the world is saying the Jews stole the land, they have no right, but the Bible tells us the complete opposite. I would like to take a look, also at another part of this real estate transaction. The Hebrew word that is used for purchasing the plot is, in English, it is a possession of a burial place. In Hebrew, achuzat kever. Kever is a grave or a burial place. And what does the word achuzah means? It's here described as possession, and it comes up in several places, and significantly in Genesis 17, when God is promising the land to Abraham, he is saying in verse 8, I give to you and to your descendants after you the land in which you are a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. An everlasting possession here is achuzat olam. So again, olam is eternal, everlasting, and achuzah is this possession. And there's an interesting study. You can look at it yourself. Where else is the word achuzah coming up in the Bible? Because it gives us an understanding of what this possession actually is. And I will quote perhaps 2 or 3 scriptures. It is Genesis 22:13. That's within the binding of Isaac, when we read that Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horn. Now the word caught is this very word achuzah. So it's something that made it impossible for the ram to move. He was caught and pinned down, as it were. Then in Genesis 25:26, this is the story in the next portion of Jacob and Esau. And when they were being born, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. That is, Jacob's hand took hold of Esau's heel. Now, where the word achuzah comes in, took hold. Again, grabbed him. So that the kind of possession signifies that you hold fast onto something. Like the ram, the thicket was holding fast onto the horns of the ram so he couldn't move. Jacob was holding fast to the leg of Esau, so that it's really indicates a something that you really hold fast to. And this is exactly the type of inheritance that God gave to Abraham. And his only task in that sense was to hold fast onto it, which is what he was doing all his life. And that's why he became such a hero of faith. Now, the commentators say that also there is another word for possession, which is Yerusha. We have the word morasha from that, for instance, and Yerusha comes up in a different context, in different situations, and usually that is where the Israelites had to fight for their possession. And so this is how you spoke about a two-way communication with God. On the one hand, we get a promise and we just are told to hold fast onto it no matter what happens. Even if the sea would roar and the mountains would fall, we still hold fast to the hope that we have in Jesus. And on the other hand, there are situations where we have to take the sword and go and fight for the possession, for the inheritance which has been given to us, be it in a situation of a sickness, of a financial crisis, of a family crisis, whatever that might be. We all go through fighting sometimes, and we have to understand that this is also part of God's testing and training and putting us into the place where he wants us to be.
No, that's true. And this concept of fighting that you mentioned, or insistence, it's even clear in that whole story is that when he approached Ephron and said, I want to purchase that land, initially actually he was reluctant to do that. He said, well, you can bury your dead here, don't worry at all, I will allow you to use the cave, and please bury Sarah. And Abraham really insists, he says, no, I want to purchase that. I really want to hold fast of that land. And they took it even to the city gate. And that's when he got the possession. And I think that's really something that also implies another quality in the kingdom of God. Like we said in the beginning, first of all, you need to, of course, to do something in order that when there is a call of God in your life, you need to turn it into action. And then also there's a need of insistence or persistence in it, where you really are willing to hold fast on that, even though challenges might arise, and say, oh, maybe because of that obstacle, maybe that's not the will of God. He never said that. He really was insisting. He says, no, this is my inheritance, and we want to hold fast on that. And I think that's an encouragement also for many believers today. That's what, even though you might find yourself in your calling, but with many challenges around, and the word of today's poor portion is, well, pay the price. This is your achusah, and make sure that you don't give up your calling and this destiny that the Lord has for your life. And the other side, of course, and that's the second part of this parasha today. It's in a way the same insistence almost. You see this very lengthy story, how it actually, the main actor of that story is quite interesting. It's not Abraham himself, but a servant. Now, most people believe it was Eliezer, but interestingly enough, the whole chapter, the word Eliezer is not mentioned. It was just called, and he called one of the servants, the oldest of his household, and he put a charge upon him. And he says, I want you to go out and get a wife for my son Isaac, who was by that time 40 years old. He didn't marry yet. And he wanted to make sure that he finds a mate for him from actually the same family lineage of Abraham, and he sent him back to Haran. And that's also, I think, one of this it's even almost, I think, double the length of the previous chapter of the purchase of the land, where we see this man going out to look for the bride of Isaac. Do you have any thoughts on that, Mojmir?
Oh, yes. Well, I think we have been following in the life of Abraham from the beginning how important it was that a lineage is established, because we do not overestimate when we say that the whole salvation of the world depended on that, because God decided by choosing Abraham, he decided to do something from one man who would give birth to a nation, to a tribe and a nation, and through that nation, God would bring salvation and the knowledge about his word, his will, his character to the world. So we can appreciate how important it is that these people would really be the right ones that God chose. And this is also why we find the stories of those who are chosen and those who are rejected. On the level of Abraham's son, we have Isaac and Ishmael. And Ishmael then got a wife from Egypt and he lived apart. Then we even hear later that other Abraham's children, which we had, they were sent off to the east. So again, so that only Isaac would remain in the land. And then, of course, it's very important who you marry. So this is the explanation why the text is so long, that Abraham really took pains to do what he felt he should do, and to take wife from, not from the locals, but from another land, actually his own heritage. And then with Isaac and with Isaac's sons, with Jacob and Esau, we see this selection again. Jacob is chosen, Isaac is rejected, Esau is rejected. So that was an extremely important process, and we can say that with those first generations of the patriarchs, God started to cultivate the good olive tree into which we are ultimately also grafted in. So we should also read it as our own story. You know, this is not only a Jewish story, but it has become our own story. Abraham is our father. We are his sons and daughters. And so it's important that God really picked the right people. And by saying that, I do not mean to say that they were perfect. And in each chapter, we see the weaknesses of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So that's not the point. But there is something. And on the part of Abraham and his descendants, it is said in Genesis 18:18 that God knew that he would teach his children and the children after them to keep the way of God, to be faithful. And faithful they have been, the whole Jewish people, throughout the centuries. Even though they had their ups and downs, even though they failed many times, there is something which made them the carriers of the word of God and those from whom the Messiah came. And I believe that we also are called to be faithful. Remember Paul, when he was at the end of his life, he said, I ran the race, I fought the good fight, and I have remained faithful. And I think that should be a goal for each of us as we are going on in years, that we would end well.
Yeah, no, and you know what you said in the beginning, this taking care of the next generation. This is so much, you can say, the definition and the core characteristic of the life of Abraham. I believe we mentioned it briefly in the past section in part 2 when we spoke about Sodom and Gomorrah, and the Lord says, I need to inform him what I'm going to do with that cities. And there it says in Genesis 18 verse 19, for I have chosen him that he may command his children and his household after him to keep the ways of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice, so that the Lord might bring to Abraham what he has promised to him. It says here, I've chosen him in order that he might command. Actually, the more literal translation is that I have chosen this because he will command his children. That means this characteristic of Abraham to take care for the next generation, that was one of the reasons why God said this man is the ideal partner to actually bring forth the purposes of God on earth. And I think this is so super important also for our time. You know, Mojmir, we spoke about it yesterday in our global prayer gathering. I think you have been with us, and we spoke about actually taking the baton to the next generation, even with the message of Israel. And the amazing thing here is, you know, Genesis 24,
This is right now the story after the purchase of the Machpelah cave. It says here now, Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed him in all things. That means this man was a blessed man in every area of his life. And he could have told him now, he said, okay, now rest, my son, he's old enough, he will take care about it. But he, even in his old age, and even though he deserved a retirement, so to speak, he discharged his chief servant, and he says, I'm not going to leave this earth until I make sure there's a lineage for the future of our family. And there is a king which I had to think when we were talking about that in the history of Israel, who had exactly the opposite. And this was King Hezekiah, where the Lord told Hezekiah, he says, well, I'm going to bring judgment over this nation, but I'm not going to do it in your generation, but in the generations after you. And then we read one of the most tragic words in the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 20, verse 19, it says, and then Hezekiah said to Isaiah the prophet, the words that the Lord has spoken are good, for he thought, why not? If there will be peace and security in my own days. And that's exactly what Abraham could have said. Well, there is peace. The Lord blessed me and all is good. And all things I am blessed. Let the Lord deal with Isaac. But he didn't think that he wanted to make sure he was handing over the baton to the next generation. And I think that's important for every family, that we make sure that we carry on the baton of faith to the next generation. It's true for ministries or for congregations, that we always make sure that the next generation is with us on the boat and they are able to carry on the legacy. And that was this whole story. And I'm not sure if you want to make comments on the character of the woman that this servant of the Lord was looking for, the servant of Abraham. It's quite interesting in verse 12. He arrived in Haran, in the place where his master Abraham told him to look for that woman. And then he said something quite interesting. He says, O Lord God of my master Abraham, please help me now. And it's quite interesting. I don't believe that he could say, well, this is already my God. But he recognized there's a God that is with my master, and he called upon him, please grant me success today. And it's quite interesting. He says, I need a woman with distinguished quality that will serve the son of my master. And he was pleading with the Lord. He says, well, let the woman that comes out, when I ask him, please give me water, she shall also says, drink, and I will water also your camels. And that was, of course, what we all know, Rebecca or Rivka. She went out and she saw this man. It says she was a beautiful, a stunning woman, very attractive in appearance. And he says, please give me a little water. And she says, drink. And she quickly went down. And when she finished giving water to him, in verse 19, she says, I will also draw water for your camels until they finished drinking. And you know, if you imagine a young, fragile, beautiful woman, that's maybe not a woman's work to feed a whole herd of camels, but she had this incredible, not only servant heart to do what was asked of her. You know, he asked can you give me some water? But she went beyond the request. I'm not only fulfilling your request, but she took the initiative. She said, you know what, I'm also going to feed your camels. And I think that's a rare quality in mankind, that, you know, sometimes we, especially in workplaces, we say, well, I just did what you asked me to do. Nobody told me to do this or that. But there was a woman which didn't wait for her to be told what needs to be done. She saw the need, took the initiative, in a way took leadership. And I think that was the perfect spouse to be the wife of a man like Isaac, who was one of the great patriarchs.
Yes, indeed. And she also must have had a sense of discernment, because there's an interesting little detail when she was returning, or she was coming with a servant who was returning to Abraham. and she had not met Isaac before, obviously. She didn't know who he was, but she recognized him immediately. And that's an interesting story at the end of chapter 24, because in verse 62, we hear that Isaac came from the way of Be'er Lahai, for he dwelt there. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field in the evening, and he lifted his eyes and looked, and there the camels were coming. Then Rebekah lifted her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from her camel, for she had said to the servant, "Who is this man walking in the field?" Now, that is a rather unusual reaction. And so the question is, what did Rebekah see? Or how did she understand who he was and what was so special that Isaac was doing? Well, the key word here is translated as he went out to meditate in the field. And the Hebrew word lasuach, there are many different theories what it actually means, but one explanation is taken from Psalm 102, verse 1, which starts by this preface, a prayer of the afflicted when he is overwhelmed and pours out his complaint before the Lord. And complaint in Hebrew is sicha. So when we hear that Isaac was doing this, it is understood that he was praying. And when Rebekah saw this, she somehow was really taken, something stirred in her, and she probably understood that this is the man for whom she is coming. So that is one characteristics. And then we know that Rebekah was quite sensitive. She received the instruction from the Lord also later on when the twins were to be born. And so she must have been quite a spiritual person. And that brings me also to another point, which I think we still need to mention. And namely, it starts here when Isaac was coming from Be'er Lahai. That is a place in the desert, somewhere in the Negev, which obviously was a favorite place for Isaac to come and to meditate. And we know from the previous portion that this is where something extraordinary happened for Hagar and Ishmael. This is where Hagar was losing all hope, and then she lifted up her eyes and saw the well. The Be'er is the well, and that actually saved the life of Hagar and Ishmael. And the question is, how come that Isaac was coming there all the time? We have many references in the scripture, which leads us to the assumption that he and Ishmael must have, been meeting from time to time at least, or at least Isaac knew the story of Hagar and Ishmael. And we mentioned that last time, that in a way, Ishmael and Isaac had a similar traumatic experience in their lives. The one was sent by Abraham to the desert and could have died, and the other was bound by his father Abraham to be sacrificed. And so in both cases, the Lord intervened, and it may be that it created such a bond between the two of them. And we see that Isaac was often coming to that place. And we see another example of their relationship in the next chapter when we read, and this is also part of this parasha, that when Abraham died, he was buried in the same burial plot that he had obtained in Machpelah. He was buried by Isaac and Ishmael. The two brothers came together to bury their fathers. And that is, of course, a great sign of reconciliation, at least, or good relations the two had. And it can be understood as a prophetic promise that the sons of Ishmael, the Arabs, and the sons of Isaac, the Jews, one day would come to terms with each other and would reconcile. And I think we mentioned that already in our last session when we were recording in Cyprus, where we were in the midst of these Arab and Jewish believers, which can be said to be the first fruit of this reconciliation, and it was quite a powerful signal or a sign that in the very week when we were hearing the stories, how the Arabs overcame their hatred and got healed and received love for the Jewish people, that in that very week, this parasha was actually read all over the world in the synagogues, and the Jewish tradition knows about it, and they do expect actually that something will happen in the last days between the Jews and the Arabs.
Yeah, it's true. And you know what is quite interesting about that passage, when we continue on to chapter 25, now you mentioned that Isaac returned from Beer Lahai. It says in verse 11, after the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahai, means it remained also his place. And I read from one of the sources, they said, well, why was Isaac at Beer Lahai? And it's exactly like you said, that he was looking for Ishmael. And they say he was actually hoping even to maybe that he would meet Hagar. And according to Jewish tradition, you find this almost in every commentary, they say the woman that is mentioned in chapter 25, it says here, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore him Simran, Yokshan, Midian, and Ishbak and Shua. That this wife Keturah was actually nobody else than Hagar. That he was, after the death of his mother, he was looking out to find Hagar, and he brought her back into the tent of Abraham. And the rabbi says she wasn't married by then, she remained single, so she could have been brought back. I'm not honestly sure if that's true. If I read the passage, it sounds to me more like he actually was looking for another wife. That's the word, another woman, so it wasn't the same from before. But what was interesting to me is that the Jewish people, they do see the possibility of Hagar returning back to Abraham. And also that goes in line to what you have been mentioning, you know, that even at the deathbed of Abraham, Ishmael and Isaac were united. And this is something that should give us all hope for the future. Isaiah 19 writes exactly about that there will be this highway between Assyria, Egypt, and Israel in the midst of them. And that those three nations, Assyria, which if you look at the map, this is a huge area today, from eastern Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan, all the way to Egypt. They will, together with Israel, will become a praise on earth. And I think the very first seed of that we find right here in those Bible passages where Ishmael and Isaac appear together. Both of them have different destinies, different callings. Isaac was the son of promise. Ishmael also a prominent blessing. 12 princes would come out of them. And even though there was this tension forecast to Hagar, says he will be in front of you in the face of all of your brothers, Ishmael. Nevertheless, at the death of Abraham, at the end of that parasha, they are together in peace and harmony, and they were burying their father.
Yes, and exactly as you mentioned, this can be taken as a sign. And one thing is certain, we should be praying for the Middle East, because I don't think there is any other area in the world today where God is moving more strongly than in the wider Middle East, which I would include Iran in that, with all the protests and the development there. And we have no doubts that God has his plans for these people. Not only that he wants that everybody comes to faith and be blessed, that is equally true for any nation, but it seems to be that he has a special plan for the neighboring countries to Israel, to Egypt, whom he calls my people, to Assyria, work of my hands, to Lebanon. We heard interesting takes how Lebanon is portrayed in the Bible as the bride. And so there are different specific promises, and it would be great if we continue praying for them. Our good friend Tom Craig has been working for years on this Isaiah 19 highway, which is again, on the one hand, holding fast to the promise, on the other hand, fighting for it with the prayers that are growing in Egypt, in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, and everywhere. And I would just close by saying, keep them up in your prayers, and just expect God to do many miraculous things in those nations. And also that means that loving Israel by far does not mean that we hate the Arabs. Quite the contrary. The more you love Israel, the more you get to love the Arab neighbors as well.
Amen. And I think we mentioned it in one of our meetings the other day. So, there are two big people group. You can say the Jewish people and the Gentiles called by God. And we, the Gentiles, have by faith, we are grafted into this olive tree, become sons of Abraham. But we notice there is actually a third group, which also are physical descendants of Abraham. And these are the sons of Ishmael, and even the sons of Esau you can include into that, which are physical descendants and received a special presence by the blessing by the patriarchs. And this legacy, those nations like Israel, they are still around in that region, and it's good for us also as the church to pray for those nations that they come into their full destiny. And I want to come back again to how we started today, and this is how Abraham is such an example to us. The Bible calls him, he's the father of us all. And I believe he's called like that because he's just the prime example what it means to receive a promise from the Lord and how to run your whole life with that promise, to be willing to pay the price, be willing to bring the sacrifice, to hold fast to that promise, to that calling, never give up. And I think that's such an encouraging message also for us today.
Yes, amen, which is a good conclusion for our three-part series on the life of Abraham. It was really a great blessing to go with you through the parashah and exchange ideas and views and interpretations. Shall we do something similar again in the near future?
From my side, yes, but it might be good to hear also some of the responses from our listener. Maybe they want to put down a few comments. If this is something that is helpful to you, we might actually go, I thought the other day, through the lives of Jacob and Isaac, because that's how God is called. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And maybe we can continue with those coming parashot also to hear what those great men, how they were living with God.
Yes, so we'll see. The Christmas season is approaching, so we will probably make a break soon in December, but we certainly aim to go back to this way of explaining the parashah, the Bible verses, which is, by the way, something we can learn from the Jews. This is their way of not listening to a monologue and having someone tell you this is the truth, period, but rather asking questions and exchanging views and trying to find the deeper truth in the form of a dialogue. And I really enjoyed that, and we are certainly going to continue one way or another.
No, and I think it's a good place also for us, Mojmir, to thank the audience, because I believe we both benefited from it. I was learning from your comments, and I believe together we could be a blessing to others. I do see the greetings here from around the world. So if this will be helpful, I think we will finish in the month to come also the life of Isaac and the life of Jacob.
Amen. And thank you also all our listeners for these very encouraging words. We really appreciate that, and it will certainly motivate us to continue. Thank you.
Yes, and I want to thank also the people in the background here. I see there's Kelera doing all the nice. I just see the screen here with the wonderful subtitles. If you watch this on YouTube or on any other channel, it looks much better than on a Zoom call, but the Zoom call is necessary for the translation. And I think we also have to give a big thank you to all the translators today, again, which are doing such a faithful work. You never see their faces, you only hear their lovely voices. But thanks to Julia and Carolina and Deborah in Thailand and Catherine and the Chinese translator. God bless you.
God bless you and see you soon again.
Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next Thursday at 4 p.m. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on our social media pages for more exclusive ICEJ content.